So thank you so much, Magda and Agatha, for inviting us and giving us the opportunity to speak. And actually, this is the first time that we are addressing a conference of this scope as researchers working outside of the region. Last autumn, after many years, as Magda said, living and working in Budapest, we had to dislocate. Although we had already witnessed the effects of the change of political climate on numerous of our colleagues and artists, in 2017 it directly affected us too. The Translocal Institute was a collateral victim of change in law about non-profit institutions, which made it practically impossible to receive funding. Legal changes also affected the CEU, where we've been teaching that became overnight practically illegal in Hungary, and its future is still uncertain, but the campaign against the university effectively destabilized and paralyzed the institution. In parallel with the anti-migrant policy of Hungarian government, we were also affected by the political changes in Britain, where British nationals living outside the country faced the uncertain consequence of Brexit. So, in a very short time, our personal geopolitical territories changed dramatically.
So, belonging to the post-89 generation, we were convinced all barriers had fallen, which was the reason we decided to live and work in a non-native Central European country. It was actually in Budapest that we saw two seminal exhibitions for our formative years as art historians, namely Aspects, Positions and After the Wall, both in 1999. And thinking in purely geographical terms, Budapest is actually an ideally located city for researching the region. However, it's impossible to think geography without also thinking about politics.
In 2014, at the conference in Lublin that Piotr organized about globalization of East European art, we claimed that nowadays we cannot talk about globalization without thinking of its effect on the planet. And we cannot talk about geography of East European art without thinking about its geology. 4 years later, with borders between European countries springing up again, with disintegration of the world political alliances, we're here to say we need to think about the global again. Not in terms of neoliberal economic globalization, but in terms of globalism, as it was formed in mind of theorists around the Second World War, and the globalism that resurfaced briefly around 1989.
So it's important to re-articulate the region of East European art in relation to other artistic regions of the globe, to unearth the connections that existed with the so-called Third World countries during the Cold War, but it's also important to rethink the relation to Western Europe that goes beyond the theoretical discourses established in previous decades. This is because the population dislocations from Eastern Europe to Western Europe have been of such magnitude that it's also affected artistic communities, so that nowadays significant segments of national art scenes actually function in the cities of Berlin, Vienna, Paris, London, Amsterdam. Especially in this decade, it's necessary to take into account such expanded territories when considering the art of the region.
And we want to make a distinction here between globalization with its enforced economic and cultural mobility and the notion of globalism as it was discussed in the wake of Second World War. As political historian Or Rosenboim in her recent book explains, the book is called Emergence of Globalism, in the 1940s, the global emerged as new all-encompassing space. The global was imagined as a point of reference for all other political units, embodying the tension between the oneness of the planet and diverse communities that inhabit it. In response to devastating total war, this global conception of politics entailed the promise of new world order.
Rosenboim emphasized the tension between diversity and unity as a central aspect of the idea of globalism. A clear distinction can be made between that and the current economic model of neoliberal globalization, which is experienced by populations around the world as a homogenizing force, provoking a populist, nationalist backlash in retaliation. The ideas of globalism that emerged in the wake of the Second World War reflected hopes for a new world order based on political, cultural, and social pluralism, when public intellectuals emphasized concerns about the future of democracy, the prospects of liberty, diversity, and decolonization.
So the ideas of mid-century globalism were also shaped by émigré thinkers who, for various reasons, had to leave their countries of origin and brought with them experience of complex, layered, thick personal geographies. And amongst them was Mihai Polanyi, brother of noted economist Karl Polanyi, who emigrated from Hungary first to Berlin and then, following the Nazism, to Britain. And in his writings, he made a distinction between private freedoms and public freedom, claiming that in authoritarian regimes, individuals might have private freedom, but not have the right to exercise the public freedom to define and implement the public good. And there was a widespread understanding in the 1940s that public intellectuals are not just specialists in their field, but have a responsibility to address the public good and be outspoken voices for the betterment of society.
The question of individual freedom and human rights would loom large again around 1948 with the consolidation of communist power and the imposition of Stalinism over the countries of Eastern Europe. For a few years, though, there was a more open horizon for rethinking the prospects for Europe, and artists and art critics also took part in that process. We can recall here the European School, an interdisciplinary artist group that was founded in Budapest in 1945 and that saw the coming of peace as offering a unique chance to rebuild European civilization according to the principles of a synthesis of East and West, as they proclaimed in their manifesto. The related abstract artist group named their exhibition space Gallery of the Four Corners of the World, while one of their seminal exhibitions was New World Vision, indicating their globalist approach to the art world. The question of public freedom came quickly to a head when artist groups were forced to disband in 1948.
A similar fate awaited numerous left-wing or socialist public intellectuals who were forced out of public life. As Czech art critic Jindřich Halupetsky put it in his impassioned essay The Intellectual Under Socialism, people who previously had not been taken seriously by anyone, all sorts of charlatans who abandoned cultural worlds, suddenly gained key positions in various official functions and public institutions. People with integrity became speechless. Almost overnight, it was possible to utter the most outrageous nonsense and spread lies without anyone raising his or her voice in opposition. And on the other hand, on the other side of the Atlantic, historian Louis Mumford wrote in 1946 about madmen, including the president himself, governing our affairs in the name of order and security and carrying through a series of acts which would lead eventually to destruction of mankind under the solemn conviction that they are normal, responsible people. And the contemporary parallels of both statements are more than self-evident. As Rosenbaum observed, with the rise of Cold War mentality, the idea of globalism was overpowered by the idea of bipolarism, with the outbreak of Korean War in 1950 ending all imaginings of the New World Order and making them even naive. So after 1950s, according to the author, the space of the globe was marginalized until it emerged again after 1989.
So let's return briefly to Michael Polanyi, who developed also the thesis of tacit knowledge to explain how knowledge is acquired through personal experience rooted in context and practices passed on through socialization rather than formed solely through formalized and codified sources. This is also related to other contemporary notions like situated knowledge or sensuous scholarship, and emphasizes here the embodied and sensual nature of epistemological processes. Tacit knowledge has played a constructive part in developing and structuring the paradigms of East European art history, and actually, from the outset, it shaped the understanding of what East European art is.
Okay, in that sense, we can differentiate, who can differentiate between epistemic knowledge of East European art and the personal experience of exchanges, for example, with Professor Piotr Piotrowski and the pioneering generation of East European art historians, which often took place in conference settings. It's worth recalling the Greek origins of symposium combining sin for together and pauses for drinking, meaning drinking wine and engaging in intellectual discussion. In other words, creating a situation in which your senses are awakened while debating ideas. We would like to argue that many of the postulates of East European art have actually been shaped in such circumstances of living repartees and exchanges between actors in the field. And this was certainly the case of socialist seminars, which many of the scholars here were also present, and Piotr was the first key speaker at the first seminar in Manchester in 2006.
Indeed, one could trace the formation of the notions of Central and East European art in the discussions held around 1989, when our esteemed forerunners of regional art history met at conferences met at conferences that define many of the concepts and debates that we are still discussing today. One such momentous gathering took place in Glasgow from the 11th to the 16th of December 1990 at the Third Eye Centre in Glasgow, at the time of it when it was the European City of Culture. And it was a very substantial undertaking with 138 delegates taking part and 64 papers given over 3 days. It was also accompanied by an exhibition entitled Expressions, curated by Andrew Nairn. And it also built on the work done at Third Eye during the 1980s, including exhibitions on Hungarian, Polish, and Soviet arts. The organisers invited, quote, veteran initiators of East-West cultural activities, those most likely to be able to take full advantage of new opportunities. And this here is a selection of the delegate list, which we won't have time to comment on. But
well, what could we learn about the geographies of East European art from this early gathering? The invited delegates came from Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, USSR, and Yugoslavia. Davor Maticevic from Zagreb claimed Yugoslavia is different from the East as well as West, but we are not the bridge between the two. A year later, the Yugoslav War started, the USSR disintegrated, Czechoslovakia separated, only Germany was already united. And these geographies have kept evolving since. Only one delegate from UK, feminist art historian Hilary Robinson, drew attention to the need to recognize the differences between the histories and traditions between East European countries and also between the republics of Soviet Union. And these lines of division of how East is Eastern Europe, as we can see, are still debated today.
So in the opening words of Hungarian curator Katalin Nerai, she comments that when she was in Glasgow, she comments that when she was in Glasgow previously, she could only talk about Hungarian art, but now in 1990, it was possible to meet in a broader constellation to discuss Central and East European issues, something that would have been inconceivable 5 years earlier. Nerai here goes straight to the point that discussing a common cohesion of the region, common cohesion of the space of Central East European art was only possible in this kind of geopolitical juncture of 89 when the region as a geopolitical reality disintegrated. Now a vivid illustration of this state of affairs can be seen in this chart of occurrences of the phrase Eastern Europe in published books from the Google Books Ngram graph, which shows a rapid peak in appearances of Eastern Europe from the late 80s to the early 90s, indicating that it was only with the political changes that was a new interest in thinking about the region as a whole rather than in terms of individual countries. We could also comment on the rise up at the end.
Just as the graph peaks from 89 to about 92, it is also when one could recognize the ideas of globalism resurfacing. And Nerai criticized the exotic exploitations of the West and demanding that East European art join the mainstream of art of Europe, that is, Hungarian, Polish, Slovenian artists would take part in any Western exhibition with the same naturalness as Dutch artists. And Polish art historian Andrzej Rottenberg stated that the function of this kind of conference is very important, and there may have been maybe 7 of us who have already met several times this year to discuss these issues. They take place mostly in the West, and always the subject is East-West, West art, or from East to West. I think this is indicative of Western complex towards the East and the lack of confidence in dealing with the people in the East. Questions such as, are you European or Belgian? And answers being Belgian, I'm always European, is why I want to ask you to consider us in this way, being particular but sharing a common world.
So the ideas of globalism, emphasizing the possibility of achieving a global unity while maintaining diversity, are closely echoed in these words, in Nerai's words. Nerai also stated that it is important to emphasize the distinctiveness as well as the similarities of regions' individual components. She called for dialogical exhibitions to replace representational exhibitions that toured the countries, meaning bringing artists from more than one nation together. This position was also reflected in Andrzej Rottenberg's exhibition Europe Unknown that took place in Krakow the following year and included artists from both East and West Europe, with many of the Points East participants also coming together for a symposium on the occasion of the exhibition. In her catalogue introduction, Rottenberg suggested that we should try to see the contemporary art in Europe as an innerly differentiated unity.
At the same time, we find out from, for instance, Davor Maticevic, that in similar meetings in Vienna and in Prague, they have also directed their attention to the question, how do we see the East European art from inside? What are its characteristics? And this line of questioning would culminate at the end of the 90s, with major East European survey exhibitions such as After the War, that could also be seen as signs of shift away from globalism to regionalism. On the one hand, these shows could be seen as celebration of the empowerment of East European art, but they could also be viewed perhaps as the precursors of retreat from global aspirations towards separatism. The early exhibitions around 89-90 were, on the other hand, all integral and dialogical. They always set East and Western artists together and were generally not instrumentalizing.
So, what was the response of the Western colleagues to these to the Eastern ideas? So, art historian Paul Overy talked about a gold curtain instead of an iron curtain to distinguish between countries with hard and soft currencies. More importantly, the ideas of neo-colonialism were mentioned in several occasions in the conference, and specifically in a paper by Henry Merrick Hughes, who stated that in Eastern Europe, state patronage in forms of prizes, commissions, and studios has evaporated. The Deutschmark and the market have rushed in to fill the void, while in former GDR, we may be witnessing the most blatant act of cultural neo-colonialism by the West. It could perhaps be observed that Western commentators, even when naming and criticizing neo-colonialism as an issue, often repeated its familiar tropes and arrogant logic by stressing the material wealth of the West and the poverty of the East.
And in fact, it was only Hilary Robinson who directed the critique to the organizers, stating, when even the cultural diversity within Britain was not acknowledged, what chance was there of considering the cultural diversity of the rest of Europe? Why were people of African and Asian descent not speaking? She also talked about the position of Scotland as she said, a stateless nation with a colonized culture, and about colonizing centrality that can be Western or Eastern, or expressed in terms of gender or race or class, nationhood or religious belief. She received a lot of defensive comments, especially from the organizers and other panelists. And one to mention is Greg Hilty, who is nowadays director of Listen Gallery in London. And he, for instance, mentioned the exhibition Magicians de la Terre in Paris in '89, and he said that it is neither economically possible nor curatorially desirable to make such exhibitions on a regular basis. And this position of hostility towards globalist and decolonizing approach to art history is only now being slowly corrected.
So it's worth quoting here again Anna Rottenberg from her presentation at the Austrian ICA conference Ostkunst, Westkunst, Weltkunst. She says, the developments in Polish as well as Czech, Hungarian and Lithuanian art are not taken into account in the studies of art history of contemporary European art. One could get the impression that in Eastern regions there was simply no art at all, as they were under communist rule. But if there had been communism in Ireland, Norway or Portugal, would their art also not have been taken seriously? If this is not the case, then maybe it's not about communism at all. And it's not exclusively a question of communism. Let us finally talk about the East. We should search for different criteria to divide up the world, for instance, financial ones. Then it would transpire that Poland lies near Ireland, in the neighborhood of Norway and China, and that the East in general actually encompasses almost the whole world. The West, on the other hand, encompasses just a handful of countries, Germany, USA, Japan, and naturally Austria. What we have here is a proclaimed solidarity with all the countries of the world that are subject to the dominance of the West, radically expanding the notion of the East to all the places that demand a decolonial approach.
Well, Eastern Europe is, however, arguably at its weakest when it comes to its own issues of decolonialization, and this can be symptomatically traced back to the Khrushchev shoe-banging incident at the United Nations in 1960, which was triggered when a delegate from Philippines challenged the Soviets to extend their proclaimed support for those oppressed by capitalism and with anti-colonial movements in the Third World to the citizens of Central Europe. And so by extension, this was still, and it still is, so he just responded with banging shoes. So by extension, generally, it was still, it's easy to criticize the colonialism of the West towards the Eastern Europe or show solidarity to colonial struggles elsewhere in the world, but we always stop short when it comes to internal colonial legacies and relationships. The prevalence of colonialist and racist attitudes can also be detected in the marginalization of Roma minority and its artists, as well as parallel disregard for the contribution of non-native artists to East European art. The ineffectiveness of mainstream of East European art in recognizing and rectifying the injustice inflicted on minorities might have backfired, And that's because of lack of solidarity for those who were the first victims of populist xenophobic wave, the contemporary art world, and those generally who hold the liberal transnational values have become the latest target of populist aggression. The chances of resisting populism depend on recognizing the intersectionality that exists between the causes of marginalized communities and the liberal-minded minority across Eastern Europe.
So another issue raised in the Point C's conference were the obstacles to the inclusion of East European art in the circuits of the international art world. This is how Greg Hilty put it. The art industry consists of artists, commercial galleries, collectors, magazines, and the critics who write for them, independent galleries and organizations, funding bodies, a few free-floating movers, and museums, roughly in that order. Artists from Eastern Europe are only beginning to become part of this self-generating industry, and even then often as a novelty, as fresh supply. Until artists from Eastern Europe become part of this system on as many levels as possible, they will not be ignored but cannot be judged or treated on an equal footing. Hilty predicts here the processes of economic globalization that quickly overwhelmed the ideals of globalism of the early 1990s. The harsh economic realities were not only an unavoidable factor for East European art scenes during the early years of transition, but also turned on the Third Eye Centre itself, which just 6 months after this conference came into a terrible financial crisis and actually closed down and had to be refounded as a different body. So shortly after these years, after these early stages, artists were included in the survey exhibitions that also functioned within the newly emerging biennial culture of the 1990s as part of artistic globalization, and the path to success that Hilty had sketched out gradually took its course.
And in conclusion, it should be observed that the possibilities to talk about East European art from a transnational comparative perspective depends on maintaining the conditions of public and not just private freedom in the region. And there are warning signs that in some countries of Eastern Europe, this distinction between private and public freedoms are resurfacing as a factor of restricting creative and intellectual expression in public debates. We also want to insist on the specificity of the moment of globalism around 1989 and the importance of distinguishing it from the processes of globalization. And it is in this expansive spirit that we want to revive in today's dreary times rather than retreating into isolation in the face of resurgent populism. Globalism corresponded to the decolonial prospect of pluriversality in which multiple and interconnected worlds can coexist, and it is important to think about East European art in terms of the coexistence of deterritorialized geographies that constitute entities in the geo-epistemology of East European art. Just as our forerunners came together through the historical conjuncture of post-89 globalism, it falls upon us in assemblies such as these at the moment of unpredictable geopolitical realignments to rethink the desirable and optimal geo-epistemologies of East European art.